want to focus on our apostolic text first, thinking about the scribes. In the apostolic scripture, the scribes and the Pharisees are often paired with each other because one could be a scribe, that is, one who could read and write, and they would write the scriptures. So, as you'll notice in our text in Matthew, it says, "And at once some of the scribes said within themselves," they're thinking this inside, "because he has said, 'Your sins are forgiven you.' And they said, 'This man blasphemes.'" Now they said this in their thinking. Verse 4 says, "But Yeshua, knowing their thoughts," and we've said in the past that this was a divine prerogative to know another person's thoughts. But I want to think about something for just a moment, this idea of the scribal elite. You were elevated in the ancient Near East if you were a scribe because the literacy rate in the ancient Near East was very, very low. There were people who could read, but who could not write, and there were people who could write somewhat, but could not read. So if you could do both, this elevates you in an era where the literacy is not very high. We take literacy, for the most part, for granted. But the scribes, and you could be either, as a scribe, you could either be a Pharisee, Sadducee, you could belong to any number of groups. And Yeshua, we are told, if you go back to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, go back if you just for a few moments at the very end of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, it says this. He's just given the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, and it says, when Yeshua had ended these sayings, Matthew 7:28, when Yeshua had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Now think about it. What would make a scribe an authority on the text? Well, it's pretty simple, because you're seeing the text all the time. You're copying it all the time. So as somebody is speaking it to you and you're writing it, or you're just reading it for yourself and writing it, you would think that over time this would make you an authority on the text. And it did. You could read it, you could write it. So my question then is, why did the scribes hate Yeshua and despise him? What do you think?
Because he knew it as well as they did.
Okay, he knew it as well as they did. Oftentimes better.
Yeah.
But why do they hate him?
Envy.
Envy? I think there's envy. I want to demonstrate that. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. They had been trained in it.
Yes.
And he had not.
That's the key. Now watch this. Okay, so let me use two examples here to help us out. Dr. Muller is a nurse practitioner. She's called into the office of the head of nursing at PLU, and she's told, you are going to be the MC for a nursing seminar. You're going to introduce our speakers. There's going to be two of them, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. Well, about 30 minutes before the seminar begins, a janitor at PLU decides that he'll go up to the podium and start talking about nursing. And in fact, he's very intelligent about it. And in fact, nurses who are milling around now get quiet and they're all listening to him. Somebody comes out about 20 minutes later and says to Mary, hey, did you realize that there was some guy up there before the program started that was talking about nursing? And actually, the guy was really good. She'd say, what? He wasn't on the docket. He's not on the program. He's not on the schedule. What's this guy? But actually, he's pretty good. They said, well, he was really good. We enjoyed him. It was very enjoyable. He was very knowledgeable. Well, he come to find out, though, this guy doesn't have a nursing degree. He's never gone to nursing school. Doesn't know anything about nursing. Another scenario. Dr. Cohen, a chiropractor. He goes to Chicago to a chiropractic convention. Same scenario. Guy gets up and starts talking about chiropractic medicine. Come to find out, the guy has no knowledge of chiropractic medicine. He's not an MD, he's not a chiropractor, no background. But he's up there talking about the latest things in chiropractic medicine. And people are going, wow, this guy's intelligent, this guy's knowledgeable. What do you think the other chiropractors, what do you think the other nurses are going to think about these individuals who take over another forum, so to speak, that's not really theirs, speak authoritatively, speak to where people who are in the know actually think, hey, this is pretty good. This is not bad at all, really. They came across as pretty intelligible. But they're not credentialed. The elite are going to say, hold on, they didn't do all the work I did. They didn't study like I did. How do they know what's what?
They're not even going to listen to him. They're not even going to hear what he had to say. Everybody else might, but those guys that are in the field are not going to be wanting to hear anything he's got to say.
Yeah, because you don't have the credentialing. You didn't go to school like we did. Let me give you an example. He's not here today. But he's talked to me about this many times. One of the things that Scotty did for 30 plus years was work on the railroad. And his job at the railroad was to help make sure that the bridges over which the rail cars would pass were solid enough so that when a whole freight train goes across an expanse, that the bridge doesn't collapse. That's got to be a pretty strong bridge. And you have to know structural engineering to make sure that that doesn't collapse. Here's the interesting thing. Scotty never took class 1 on structural engineering. It was intuitive. It was just intuitive. He got it. I took piano lessons. Today I can't go to the piano and play one note after the other that makes sense. There was a girl in my high school that sat down at the piano, never took a lesson, and could play anything that you whistled. She could play the tune. Never had taken a lesson. And she could play with chords and everything. Never lesson 1. So it was interesting because, back to Scotty for a second, there would be, at his job, he would be paired with other people at job sites. And these other guys these younger guys that were coming up, had degrees, sometimes master's degrees, in structural engineering. Now, Scotty had been on the job at this time 10, 15 years, and they would say to him, well, I got a degree in engineering, so this is how we should do it. And Scotty would say, that's great, but if you do it like that, it's going to collapse. And they'd say, well, how do you know that? I said, well, because we've seen people try to build it like that, and when they did it like that, it didn't work. So I can tell you what works, because I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what works. And these guys had difficulties because they went to school. They knew they had been in school, and they knew exactly how it was supposed to work. So some guy who'd never gone to school, who didn't have any credentials telling them how things should work, didn't go over it well at times. Now back to the text. Yeshua is not a scribal elite. He's not gone to the scribal schools. Let me pause this just for a moment for you. I said something last week that was somewhat controversial. I said that Yeshua was unclean. Here's one for you. Yeshua may have been illiterate. May have been, by their standards, by the scribal standards. They might have considered him kind of a backwater. He's from Galilee. And the Galileans are nice people, but they're just not the smartest. They're not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Okay? They didn't go to the schooling that we did. They don't know how to read and write to the extent that we do. So when he stands up and he goes to some of their places, he goes to synagogues, he goes to the temple, and these are places where they're expected to hold court. And he stands up in the synagogue and he reads. And he expounds the text. And they say to themselves, how does this guy come across telling us what we know already? So he may not have been like the scribal elite. He didn't go to their schools. He didn't jump through all their hoops. They did not have in their framework the possibility that somebody could intuitively have this. Yeah.
I was just thinking too, that they looked down at him because of his age as well, because at one part where they said, you're not even 40 years old yet, how would you know Moses or something?
Right, 50, yeah, 50, you're right,
Oh,
50,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
50.
But, so I think it just was out of their box. Didn't
Right,
you?
it's outside their box. My father-in-law was this way in regards to, he never took a class on mechanical engineering. But my father-in-law understands mechanical engineering. It blows me away how he never went to class for it, and he could describe to you how to put something, you could tell him, look, I need to do this particular job. He'd say, well, we can build a machine that'll do that for you. We can make that work. He worked for Scott Paper for 30 plus years, maybe longer, machining parts for their big machinery, and never took a class for it. He just intuitively figured, this is how parts work together. It was all just in here. I had a cousin who never took an auto mechanics class. I took auto mechanics class today, you wouldn't want me around your car.
Amen.
Thank you.
No problem.
He understood mechanics of a car. He could take a car apart, I could do that part. But anybody can take a car apart. No, most of us. But then I would have a lot of pieces left over if I were trying to put it back together. You shouldn't have a bunch of pieces left over if you're going to put it back together. That's what I'd have. But he could pull your car apart. He could put it all back together, and he never took an automotive class. Nobody ever said to him, "This is how you do this." It was just intuitive. He just got it without ever having to study. Let me suggest
I
to
bet you
you.
somebody helped teach him.
What?
I bet you he learned it from somebody. The person that played the piano, somebody probably said, hey, have you ever thought about this? Or somebody in their family did it, and they saw it.
Oh, they may have saw it.
There's
what I'm
ways
saying.
of doing it, maybe not formally,
Right.
but, even with mechanical stuff,
Right. But there are
that's
people.
what guys do, they hang around the end.
Right, but there are people who just, without having to see anybody else do it, without even having to be around anybody else doing it, they just get it. I mean, on the bigger picture of things, they don't have to study, and for that particular skill set, they just get it.
Brent?
Yes.
Not only the fact that they were jealous of him, but part of the reason that they were jealous of him, two things. One, could anything good ever come out of Galilee? Number two is they considered him an illegitimate child.
Yes.
In
Yeah,
the society of things,
Right.
he was
Right, there's the consideration of him as illegitimate. There's also the fact he's from Galilee, and I think the big issue though is this: there was a arrogance, a hubris, on the fact that we are the scribal elite because we studied. We went to school and jumped through all the hoops. He didn't. Now he's going to stand at the same podium that we do, and he's going to say the same kind of things that we do in the same kind of forums, and people are going to, here's the interesting thing. If you're in a particular forum, those who don't know any better might assume that you know something. So those who didn't know that he wasn't credentialed would listen to him and go, this guy sounds pretty good, not too bad. Overall, quite credible.
Brent,
Yeah.
one more thing is that of the apostles, he didn't pick those from the elite.
No,
He picked fishermen,
Right.
people of low estate.
yeah. He didn't
And God
hang around.
made them much
He didn't
greater
hang around the
than all the
intelligent.
elite.
Right. He didn't hang around the intelligent people necessarily, the ones that were considered the upper level intelligence. Yeah.
Go on your premise here. One other thing, when they brought the adulteress before Yeshua, he wrote on the ground.
Right.
So he knew how to write and
Right. I mean, that's,
describe it.
yeah. We don't even know what he wrote. But yeah, very limited. So very limited. What I'm saying is this: he wouldn't be outside the norm in that time of the ancient Near East to not be functionally literate. It would not have been outside the norm. I think this is what bothered them. Those who are educated tend to have difficulty with those who can do the same job who are not in the same area. That becomes difficult. All right. So these scribal elite all the way through have the text in their heads. Now look at what it says. He taught them as one having authority. How did the scribes teach? If you go back and look, they teach like this. So-and-so said of so-and-so, who said of so-and-so, this. Yeshua just says, this is the teaching. This is what the Word of God says. He doesn't try to quote other people who are quoting other people. He's just saying, look, this is what God says. Not worried about what everybody else is saying along the way. And so he says he taught as one having authority. So the scribes have difficulty with him. We'll talk more about that a little later on. Any other questions or comments?
Wasn't that also in part, they didn't recognize who he was because he's the Word that made flesh. I mean, he was the Word. He lived. He's the author.
Sure.
But they didn't understand where he was coming from. They didn't see him who he was.
No, they didn't see him. By the way, though, I'm convinced that we don't see him for who he really is.
I don't think we can.
The irony is this: we have the revelation of Yeshua the Messiah on the pages of the text, and I still don't think we understand who he is. I still don't think we get it. Because I hear people saying things that just boggle the mind, coming out of traditional thinking. Yeah.
It seems like, these people who had all this education, their ways was so, you have to do this is like a works kind of thing, you have to go to school for 4 years, you have to do this, you have to do that, and then you have to apprentice, and blah, blah, and then they kind of put themselves up on this pedestal, and so anyone else who doesn't do that has to pay their dues, and so therefore you no respect.
Right.
I know and people haven't really changed very much. I mean, it's in all the fields. I remember one time when my son was going to go to he decided not to do university, but to go to community college, and my sister was looking down, you can't go to the community center, community college, because that's not as a respect for university. But it's the same classes, and they're accredited, but it was almost like this thinking that, we have set in our minds what we feel is important, what is credible.
Right.
But if it's out of our thinking, we can't really respect that.
Right. Yeah.
There's a flip side to this whole thing, though, too. To go back to your example, if some guy got up at a chiropractic seminar and started speaking, and it turns out this guy really isn't a chiropractor and he's got some pretty good ideas, he might have some pretty good ideas, but at the same time, he might be way the hell off on something that could really screw some people up pretty badly.
True. But then so could other chiropractors who are credentialed.
That's true, but you would expect less of that with somebody who's at least had training.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right. You're
I
absolutely
think the whole point of this is we're going at
you
Yeshua here, not man.
Well,
right.
We're looking at Yeshua. We're looking at,
But I'm
They
saying,
don't, but they don't know that. If
They
you're
don't
looking
know
at
that.
another man and you hear this guy speaking, you're going to go, whoa, wait a minute, is this right?
they're convinced it's other man. They don't think
That's not the.
it's
That's not the point.
well, admittedly they don't understand who he is in his divinity.
He was reachable, and the other people, people could relate to him, the college people could relate to him, but the elitists had a hard time because to them, I'm sorry, he's, doing all these things,
Right.
so therefore.
But what would be wrong? What would be wrong with a person who isn't a chiropractor having actually some good things to say that might be beneficial? They could. It's not outside the realm of possibility. And in fact, if you listen to the Gospels, they keep coming. The scribes do. Watch this as you're reading your apostolic scriptures. They keep coming to him, trying to trip him up. They keep putting questions in front of him, saying, they come, it says that they'll say the text, and they came testing him. And so they're trying to show, they want to shame him in front of the audience. Say, well, let's ask him some questions that he won't be able to answer, because if you were a scribe, you'd know how to answer this. But since he's not, he won't know. And so he says things to them. He'll say, okay, I'll tell you what, before I answer your question, you answer one of my questions. And then he stumps them. And they go, well, okay, now what do we do? And so he's able to show that, hey, look, he can work in the text just as much as they can. I'm just saying that there's sometimes there's sometimes elitism that plays itself out in these texts, that we have to see that he's going into the synagogue, he's going into their territory, the synagogue, the temple, and he's stepping up to the podium, so to speak, and saying, hey, let me teach you what the Bible says, what the text says. And they go, hey, hold on, that's our area. That's what we do. We tell people what the text says. And then he's good. He's very good at it. And they say, hold on, we better trip this guy up. He's got a crowd. There's a crowd following this guy, and they're starting to think he's pretty good. They're starting to think better of him than they do of us.
Now, weren't there synagogues and teaching in the Galilee?
Yes, and he does that. But you know what? The people that would normally get up to read and expound on the text were scribes. Those who had some education. Because you know what? You have to be able to read and you have to be able to write in order to be able to do that. And you have to have gone, not just that, but you have to have gone through from their thinking, you have to have gone through one of their schools. You have had to have some type of mentorship, some type of apprenticeship. You don't just do this without, okay, so Dan does electrical work. Well, before anybody can just go out and wire a house or wire a building, they have to serve an apprenticeship. They have to prove that they can wire a house so that it doesn't burn down when people flip on the switches. So you've got to go through some classes, and not only do you have to go through some classes, but then somebody has to work with you to make sure that and check your work to make sure that what you're doing is working. It's going to work. So it's an apprenticeship. Well, Yeshua doesn't have any apprenticeship. He doesn't have any mentors. And so they're looking at him going, this guy is off the grid. Just trying to get our thinking into why they have a problem with him. From a natural perspective, if you have studied in a particular area and you hear somebody else discussing your area and they don't have credentials, your initial response on a human level will be, they have no authority. They haven't jumped through all the hoops. They have no right to speak to my area. They have not studied in my area. They've not gone to school. They've not gotten credentials. They have no right to address this area.
Now, weren't there regional rivalries as well?
There were, yes.
Well, I'm thinking, he was a carpenter's son. He was a carpenter. My nephew was a carpenter. He was really grody. And so here's these, he's just blue collar.
Right.
And so here's these white collar elites going, this is just some smelly carpenter,
But they say that, in fact, at one time they say, isn't this the carpenter's son?
Yeah, he's just some smelly guy.
Right. How can a blue collar guy? I mean, it'd be like you driving up to. You have to go to Oregon for this. You drive up and you get out of your car. Actually, stay in your car. And they say, how much gas you want? The guy pumps your gas. And then you drive off, and next thing you know, you see him at a seminar giving a lecture, and you go, "Well, did he just pump up my gas?
Yeah.
How can this guy that smells, who's a blue collar guy, how can blue collar people be intelligent?
Right.
They don't go to the halls of academia. They don't have credentials. They don't read. They're part of the large section of society that doesn't read. They're functionally illiterate.
Just a worker bee.
They're just a worker bee. They just work. And the job they do is very simplistic. You can basically teach it to a 10-year-old. So it doesn't require a high level of knowledge to be able to do this job. And so they have a problem with him because he's just blue collar.
They're such great thinkers.
They're white collar. Yeah.
Part of it is legitimate, though. I mean, from their perspective, if you don't know who he is, it's a legitimate complaint. If you walked into the room and said, I'm here to wire your house, Dan's going to stand up and go, the hell you are, you're not an electrician.
Right.
And it'd be a valid concern.
Right. But let's take that off. Let's take it off the electricity thing because that has some legalities behind it. How about a guy who says, no, I didn't take auto mechanics class, but I can repair your car. That happens a lot. People fix their own cars all the time. They didn't take one auto mechanics class. Now they may have a book that they study out of. That may be. But my cousin never
But it's
looked.
not a legality issue with an electrician as far as I would be concerned.
Well-
It's a safety issue.
But I bet there's people.
And I'm sure there are guys that go out and do their own electricity.
They do.
But if I'm a guy who's going to come in, I mean, if I walked into the room and said,
Right.
walked up to a new construction site and said, oh yeah, I'm doing your electrical today.
Right. In that instance, there may be a safety issue. I agree with you.
There's a safety issue.
Right.
But in this one, you're talking about someone's faith, and I mean, like we were talking about this morning, does your faith spin off into some unknown because nobody's there to check you for it?
Right.
So are they really doing an evil, or are they doing what they think might be a...
Oh, I think that they think that they're doing right. I think that they think that they're doing right. Absolutely.
Because the conversation sounds an awful lot like we're condemning them as these horrible guys.
No.
I'm going,
No,
I
I'm
think
saying-
these guys might be doing what they think is right to try
Absolutely.
and protect people
Exactly.
from who is this guy? We don't, you know...
But is that not somewhat the elitism? To think that those who have education can tell those who possibly don't that they're wrong. Forgive me, but I think that that's some of what's going on here, is that there's a little bit of that elitism that when it comes to the text, which if you can read it, hey look, in a sense this was the Catholic Church going back, we read the text for you. We tell you what the text says. Because we studied, in fact, for that reason we'll just keep the text here on the tied to the pulpit. You don't even need it because even if you could read it, which you can't, you couldn't understand it. You need us to help you. And that elitism caused problems as well. Yeah.
Well, I think it's also giving people a chance, like I know what Christians say, because, you know, you have to find out where this person's coming from, you know, before you
Right.
trust them. But I mean, even Nicodemus, he said when he went, he was a higher echelon too, and he sensed something about Yeshua, went to see him and got to know him, and then had made his own kind of, you know, evaluations of what he could do. So, I mean, like for me, you know, there's sometimes when I have students that I need to work out certain plans for, and I listen to parents sometimes because they know their kid better than anything. Now, if I were like real Elise about, well, parents don't know anything about, I went to college, blah, 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 but, you know, you just got to get to know people and really
Sure.
judge where they're coming from.
Sure.
You know.
No, absolutely. I'm just trying to say that sometimes, as we're looking at this text, the reason why the scribes have difficulty with it is because he didn't jump through all their hoops. And he was just as good, I would argue better, than they were at interpreting the text. And he had not gone through to all the hoops that they went through. That's a human level. Right.
He was
Admittedly.
doing that,
Huh?
he was doing that at age 12.
Yeah, he's sitting at age 12 in the temple, and they're amazed at his responses and his ability to argue with them and to debate with them. At the age of 12. That's the first, other than his birth narratives, we